Hello, I'm Rachel Babin from Oncology News Australia, proud producers of the Oncology Journal Club and the OJC Meets podcasts. Today's episode asks the question, is there anything funny about euthanasia? Eva Segelov meets Andrew Denton, the Australian comedian, Gold Logie-nominated television presenter and podcast host. Andrew is also the founder of Go Gentle, an organisation whose role he sees as the shop's stewards for the terminally ill. In this poignant and thought-provoking episode, Eva and Andrew explore the intricacies of voluntary assisted dying. For regular news and podcast updates, subscribe to the Oncology newsletter on oncologynews.com.au. It's free and it's a great way to support the OJC. This is Rachel Babin and this is the Oncology Podcast.
G'day. This might be the most exciting day of my life, or the most exciting interview I've ever done for OJC, because I am a fangirl groupie of our guest from way back. I'm talking about none other than Mr. Andrew Denton, who's well known to all of us for his contribution over many years. And I am going to ask him about my fond memories of him as a comedian and how that marries with the topic that we are going to discuss today. Andrew, welcome to OJC Meets.
Eva, thank you so much. I didn't think anyone remembers me as a comedian. Certainly my family don't.
Oh, they missed maybe the best part then, Andrew.
When my son was about 16 and I made a pretty average dad joke to my wife, Jennifer, and he just looked at me and he looked at Jen and said, "Mum, is this really the best you could do?" Which I thought was pretty funny.
That was funny. Yes. And of course, we love your wife as well, and we'll have to try and get her on the show. But Andrew, the reason we're talking to you for our OJC audience, which is a global audience, that might be a bit of an exaggeration. We have a co-host in Belgium who has 6 listeners, but we have a big following in Australia and New Zealand and various other countries of oncologists, and particularly more junior oncologists and trainees, lots of nurses, people from the pharmaceutical industry. And this journal club runs about once a week and we review current papers, but we also have this OJC Meet series where we interview people who we think are interesting, topical, and you're all of those things and more.
Oh,
Andrew,
thank you. I'm actually really thrilled to be talking to the audience you just described, particularly 6 people in Belgium.
Yes, they're pretty exciting. It's Hans and his mother, and I think they're neighbours.
I love the fact you can name them.
Yes, that's it. So, Andrew, look, we come to this interview arising from the topic of euthanasia, voluntary assisted dying, or assisted suicide as it's known in different jurisdictions around the world. You're a passionate advocate for this. So we're going to explore this a little bit more, but I want to start off by asking you, is there anything funny about the topic?
There can be funny things. I remember one of the doctors, a GP I interviewed in Victoria, a man who came to be assessed by him to see if he was eligible. And it's a difficult process to be found eligible, and it's sometimes hard to find a doctor who will actually do that for you, even though the law's been existing in Victoria for a couple of years. When the doctor assessed him and saw that he was clearly eligible, the man grabbed him by the hand and said, "Thank you, doctor, you're such a lifesaver." And there was a brief pause and then they both started laughing.
Well, I must say we had a patient who wanted to sign up to our COVID COVID-19 vaccine trial, who was on the VAD, had signed up for VAD. And at first it sounds bizarre, voluntary assisted dying, but that's actually the essence of it. He wanted to choose how he wanted to die. He didn't want to die of COVID-19.
Yeah, that makes entire sense to me. And it also supports the idea people who choose voluntary assisted dying aren't doing that because they want to die. They're doing that because they are dying. And it's amazing how long people hang on. And the fact that he wanted to do the vaccine trial suggests, like the vast majority of us, that he didn't just want to live as long as possible, but to live as well as possible.
So to me, it's a no-brainer. But there's obviously huge emotion overtones, religious overtones. Maybe people feel it's against the Hippocratic Oath. What are the common arguments against it, and how do you counter these in your advocacy work?
Wow, how long do we have? I've heard so many arguments against it, but the most common ones, two you just described, the Hippocratic Oath, which is a valid argument. You know, you can't argue with people that hold to the Hippocratic Oath and do no harm as meaning to them, I should never assist someone to die, or to take the original version of the oath, I should never administer a poison. But it's equally valid for doctors to go, look, doing harm is to leave someone who's dying to suffer. So there's that. A very common argument against is that, well, there's either the misrepresentation that palliative care can deal with all pain and suffering at the end of life. Now, palliative care does a remarkable job, but even they say, no, that's not true. And so this binary is created saying, well, you can't have assisted dying until everybody has gold standard palliative care, which is, of course, an endless bar that you can raise for 1,000 years. Even if that were economically and logistically possible, it still wouldn't solve the issue. There's the sanctity of life question, which is very real for many people, that this is God's domain. God gives us life, only God takes it away. It's not for us to do it. And there's the slippery slope question. And there's what's called the logical slippery slope, which is once you invoke these laws and allow a certain category of people to be assisted to die, then you can't possibly say no to any other categories of people, which is a really good argument, except that it's completely contradicted, for instance, by what's happened in America for the last 20 years. But let's not let the facts get in the way of a good theory. And then there's, I guess, what you call the moral slippery slope, which is that it's, I suppose, you're crossing a Rubicon, which is what Paul Keating said. You cross a Rubicon in our society once you allow society to take somebody's life, which again sounds very plausible, except that we've had laws which allow these decisions to be made for a long time. People can choose to stop all treatment and stop eating and drinking and be medically supported. The law allows you to do that. It says it's not suicide. There's only one reason somebody does that, because they are dying and they wish to get it over with as quickly as they can. They will die in the end. You can cut that whichever way you like. They're going to die in the end. So it is a decision to hasten your death. The only thing is the law insists that it be slow. There are other ways under our law where you can stop, and you would know this as an oncologist, you can stop chemotherapy and nobody can stop you. And nobody's going to demand, as they do with assisted dying, when it's debated, oh, you've got to go and see a psychiatrist, or we need you to jump through 30 hoops.
You can refuse curative treatment, in fact, not just palliative treatment. If you have a curable cancer, you can refuse to get that treated, and you will die. And we've all seen the very sad cases where that happens because of some misguided beliefs about perhaps herbs or other treatments curing cancer. So you're right, that's not forbidden.
Tragically, our laws allow, though of course they don't condone suicide, which is what we know from the various coroner's reports around the country. Terminally ill people do take their own lives, and often very brutally. So it is a plausible argument. It's a fiction that voluntary assisted dying is suddenly we've crossed this Rubicon where society is allowing people to choose how to end their lives. We've already crossed that Rubicon. It's just that what the law allows before voluntary assisted dying is often slow, sometimes tortuous, sometimes cruel, and psychologically really scarring, not just for the people going through it, but for their families and their carers who are watching on.
And of course, we don't let our pets suffer. I've got a beautiful black lab and he's getting older. Melbourne's the home of dog lovers, so I'm very happy here. But no one would let their pet suffer. In fact, they often euthanize their pet at the vet well before the onset of any potential suffering.
Look, it's how I hear it most commonly put by just people in the street, and it is true. Now, you could counter that by saying, well, of course, pets don't have self-awareness. There's not the same moral judgments involved, but it is a question about how we choose to treat another being, in this case, a pet that we love. And I'm pleased to hear you say suffer, because suffering is actually the word here. And I often hear, particularly doctors that argue against these laws, they're always restricted to pain. I remember one pretty well-known doctor, very good writer and media performer. I was sitting next to her on the ABC's Q&A and she said, you know, I've never seen anyone in all my career die screaming in pain. We've got very powerful drugs at the end of life which can deal with these things. And it's true, there are very powerful drugs at the end of life, but they don't necessarily deal with all pain, and they certainly don't deal with all suffering. And all they are is a response to suffering that exists. and may have existed for a long time. And the use of those drugs prior to voluntary assisted dying laws was in the hands of doctors. And some doctors are brilliant and want to do everything to help. And some doctors feel very strongly, I will never hasten death. And some doctors are afraid of being reported because they may have hastened death. So it varies how quickly people will be titrated into a coma. That's the bit that in parliamentary debates, MPs struggle to understand. It's not just about what patients are suffering. This is actually about trying to wrest back control from a medical community, elements of which are deeply morally conservative. And, I have evidence from around the country now, including having pulled some medical records using freedom of information, about what happens to people when doctors with a strong moral view don't wish to provide or accede to requests that people clearly make for the suffering to be stopped, and they leave them suffering for days on end.
Oh, Andrew, anyone who's practiced for as long as I have has seen this over and over again. And if they tell you they haven't, they're not telling you the truth.
Well, I'm pleased to hear you say that, Eva, because I've got to say, having been exploring this for the last 6 years, and that's why I'm very pleased to talk to this audience. And by the way, I'll preface this by saying I have no objection to anyone's moral objection to VAD. I think that's a personal thing and you have a right to hold it. And I would not argue with you if that is your belief. But I have a deep objection and a great distress when I hear medical professionals who must know the truth that you just talked about, who go and present to parliamentarians, and they do, and suggest that these things are either not happening or under control. I think that is a betrayal of doctors' ethics. And it really bothers me that these people, they often fly under the flag of mercy, or they stand on the mountain of morals and ethics, and they quote the Hippocratic Oath. And I think it's a big part of the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing and why Go Gentle exists. Doctors have the AMA and other unions. We see ourselves as the shop stewards for the terminally ill. And I think even with VAD laws being passed, there is still a lot of work to be done. In South Australia, which passed this law earlier in the year, for reasons yet to be revealed, the Health Minister has appointed as the head of their implementation committee a senior doctor, the current Vice President of the AMA, who is ethically opposed to VAD and is on the record of multiple interviews around the country suggesting that VAD is just a slippery slope. And in fact, in one interview in Western Australia, referred to VAD being about doctors having a godlike power to take people's lives. But there are real questions still and real challenges still, even with this law existing, about making sure that the people who it's designed to help, who are people who are terminally ill and suffering at the end of life, are being sufficiently helped and aren't being impeded.
So, Andrew, you're so passionate. You talk about being the shop steward for the terminally ill. I guess your career advisor in Year 10 didn't pick that as a career. So tell us, has this become more of a passion for you over time, and have there been any particular triggers?
It's become my full-time job. I put my media career entirely behind me, and I'm perfectly happy about that.
Apart from this interview.
Apart from this interview, this is my long-time plan to outreach to 6 people in Belgium, finally achieved.
Amazing.
Yes. So tick, another life's ambition done.
Yes.
The trigger has been the true and ongoing and genuine and deep stories of suffering that I have heard. And equally, what I just described as the denial of them. I think it's a great scandal. I actually think it's a great scandal. I think, we've had royal commissions into banking and abuse in childcare institutions and others over recent years, and we've seen parades of people appear on our evening news, and they've been very, very powerful. They've given us an insight into something that's deeply wrong. I believe had there been a royal commission into how people are treated at the end of life in this country, there would be a great level of shock at some of what goes on. And in saying that, I just wish to make it very clear that I think the majority of people, or in fact everyone engaged in the end of life, intends to do the best. But I think on this issue, when it comes to hastening life, there is a deep moral blind spot which has allowed some terrible things to happen and continue to happen.
Oh, I wouldn't be too worried about not having a Royal Commission, because I don't think anything changed in any of those industries after the Royal Commission. But Andrew, I want to talk to you about, you're very much focused on the medical. In my experience, actually, it's the nurses who control the medication in the terminal phases of life. Tell us about your experience with the attitude of nurses towards VAD and why their voice isn't heard perhaps as much as some strident medical voices for and against.
When I first got involved with this, there was the only peak medical body in Australia who had it as their formal position to support assisted dying, but was the ANMF, the Nurses Union. And I always thought that was very telling, because who's at the bedside, who's seeing this unfold 24/7? it's the nurses. Yes, they control the medications at the end of life, but that's still on doctors' orders. They can't increase medication without that approval, as I understand it. So I remember talking to Coral Levitt, who used to be I think was the vice president of the ANMF and the New South Wales president. And she described to me what it was like to have a patient who was begging for the suffering to be ended and not being able to do anything. And she said, I would just go into the pan room and cry. There are, of course, nurses that oppose this, again, on moral grounds. Again, they have a right to. But in Victoria, I really want to give a shout out to the Nurses Union in Victoria. I'm not sure they know what a crucial role they played. So that legislation was the first state in Australia to pass this law in 2017. And it was a really pitched political battle. The stakes were very high because those that opposed the law knew that if Victoria's law came into existence, it would, as it has, disprove their arguments about it being unsafe or destroying palliative care or destroying the doctor-patient relationship or the arguments that are put forward. So it was a very pitched battle. And it was only 4 votes in the upper house, which meant that if 2 MPs had been persuaded not to vote for it, it wouldn't have got through. And one of those MPs was an independent called James Purcell. Now, I still remember his speech, and I think he was an accountant by trade. He certainly had no background in this issue. And he basically stood up and said, I wish I didn't have to be standing here talking about this issue. But he said, I've consulted widely in my electorate, and one group I've spoken to are nurses, and not a single nurse in my electorate has said anything other than please pass this law. And on the basis of that, I'm going to be voting for this. So the nurse's voice has been very important in this debate.
So the other thing that sometimes surprises me is how little doctors, oncologists know about euthanasia, where our colleagues in Europe, including in our 6th listener country of Belgium, have had it for many, many years, 20, 30 years, Belgium, the Netherlands and various others. And I remember asking one of my colleagues, my good friends, about it. And she said, oh, yes, I routinely, over there, it actually has to be the treating doctor who administers intravenously the solution. And she says, it's always the best day of the week. You know, it's part of my treatment of that patient. And I remember she told me her senior nurse that she'd worked with all her career found out that he had cancer. And he wanted euthanasia immediately, which is available there at any time. There's no time frame in Belgium. And she convinced him to try some treatment first. So it was sort of a role reversal. But, you know, we don't hear from doctors. It's sort of secret business, but it's routine for a very small number, but routine in other countries.
Look, there are different cultures. In the Netherlands, for example, you usually have your GP for life. So you've known them all the way through. And so they are the logical person to assess you for euthanasia, but they can still conscientiously object. It's, you know, the core of all these laws is they're voluntary. In Belgium, interestingly, when they passed their law, at the same time, they passed a law mandating locked-in and greater funding for palliative care, and they integrated their euthanasia into palliative care. And one of the people I spoke to when I went over there was the former head of palliative care, Arsène Mully, and he was this beautiful man. I said to him, I had lunch with him after the interview, and I said, if I ever die, I want you to look after me. And he said this great thing. I said, why do you think there's such resistance to this in other countries, palliative care? And he said, I don't understand why anywhere in the world there resist this. How do you say to somebody who you can't help medically anymore, keep suffering, tomorrow it will be better? And he described it as an act of love. He actually used the expression, it's a sacred act. But I think it's our Judeo-Christian background. I don't fully understand why the Belgium, the Netherlands, the Benelux countries have such a different culture to ours. But I will say the conversation is changing. And the voluntary assisted dying debate, to my mind, has never just been about voluntary assisted dying. It's about better end-of-life care across the spectrum. And it asks questions of the entire medical community. How well are we doing this? Are we being patient-centered? Do we say we're being patient-centered, or are we being patient-centered? And one of the people I interviewed, Dr. Peter Langer, who runs the acute medicine at Royal Melbourne, he said that assessing for VAD had changed his medical practice. It was very interesting. He said, I realized, somewhat to my shame, that when I was just asking people about, well, tell me about your symptoms, your suffering, I was subconsciously leading them to talk about the things I knew I could treat, which was often physical pain. And I've come to understand, because the assisted dying assessment process mandates that you ask a much wider set of questions and you really explore what is the issue here. He said, I've come to understand that suffering is much broader than what I had understood it as. And so it's changed the way now I speak to my patients to find out what is the cause of their suffering.
And Andrew, I've heard that from Dr. Phil Parenti, one of our doctors who was quite opposed due to religious reasons, he said, and has become involved and now is quite a passionate advocate. So it is interesting that people judge from afar and you can't really try it and then have an opinion about it, like many other things.
Well, look, I found as I got talking to doctors around Australia, including my family doctors, both of whom I've been blessed by great doctors. And I love these two local GPs up in Wentworth Falls where I grew up. And neither of them support voluntary assisted dying. I haven't spoken to them recently. They may have come round a bit. Kath, she's of Catholic, so that's probably a moral hurdle for her. And Vic, I'm not sure he's so religious. But Vic said to me, for instance, look, we take care of people if at the end of life if we have to. And I'm sure there are many doctors that do that. But I was always struck by the AMAs arguing against these laws and how stridently they did, because what they're actually arguing for was for doctors to continue to do these things in the dark, in secrecy, without consultation, without a second opinion, without guidelines, without any of those things. They're actually arguing for their doctors to keep quietly breaking the law and nobody will say anything about it. And the whole point about these laws, beyond what we were just discussing about, it mandates a much broader and deeper interrogation into what's happening at the end of life than has existed previously, is to actually, first of all, provide choices and protection for the terminally ill, but secondly, to provide protection and guidance for doctors. And, in the Netherlands, which has had the longest conversation about this of any country in the world, it was their doctors that insisted this law be written. It came from their medical community because they had been assisting people to die and it was understood and it was kind of happening half in the open, but there were court cases. Doctors were taken to court and usually the courts did not find them guilty. In fact, they didn't, but doctors were unhappy with this situation. So just to go back to your point before about doctors here don't understand this, I think it is in doctors' interest to understand this, particularly if they're going to be, as most doctors will, dealing with patients at the end of life at some point. Not because you need to practice it, and as I said before, that is absolutely a private choice, but to understand why the laws exist and what they're designed to do. I think that is of deep interest to any medical professional. I was really surprised at something I hadn't understood when I got involved with this. I assumed doctors were just conversant with death because that's, of course you deal with that. But I've been quite surprised to discover that many are not or are uncomfortable with it. And the more I've looked at that, the more I thought, well, of course, we're all human. A lot of people are very uncomfortable with death. I personally am deeply opposed to it.
I don't think there's any training throughout medical school on death. I don't think there's one lecture on death. I think the other thing that strikes me, as you said, there's very little data. I think the fear of people in funding studies or getting data is that it'll actually support the argument. And if it doesn't, then they've got nothing to lose. But there is very little data. There is opinions and surveys, but where is the data about people recording suffering, people's pain scores? And it is all there. It's just, so my passion for this is bringing some data, not making any judgments. You're an advocate. My passion is to see some data so that we can make a more informed decision as we do about every other aspect of medicine.
I totally support that. And Victoria's law has led to a slew of research projects, which is good. And I'll be fascinated to see what those are. Two pieces of data I do recall. One was from Professor Charlie Cork, who's now the acting chair of the Victoria's Assisted Dying Review Board, who's an intensivist in Victoria. And when he appeared before the Victorian Inquiry into End-of-Life Choices, which ultimately recommended Victoria pass the law, which it did pass, he said something really fascinating relating to what you've just referred to, which is that in Barwon Health, they did a study of patients' notes to see how many references there were to what the patient was feeling, not their white blood cell count, not what they'd been given, but what the experience was like for the patient. And he said across all their notes, there was only 5% of them had any mention of what the patient was actually feeling. And the other person I recall is a palliative care physician in New South Wales called Dr. Linda Sheehan, who I really respected. She didn't support voluntary assisted dying, but she used her Churchill Fellowship to go and look at the impact of assisted dying and euthanasia on palliative care around the world and found, as palliative care themselves have since found, that there'd been no negative impact at all. In fact, they'd by and large improved. But she also did another research project where she looked at, and it's pretty much the only research project I know that's been done within palliative care, about patients' requests at the end of life. And I remember the exact numbers, but there was a very high number of requests. A high number of palliative care doctors had received requests at the end of life. A high number of palliative care doctors receiving those requests said they were uncomfortable receiving them. That's all I've seen. It was a tiny sliver of research. I wrote to Linda and I said, I think this is brilliant research, but, and forgive me for sounding critical, what's missing in there is you haven't asked any of your patients how they feel about the care you're offering. And I still think that's missing. And, I've heard so many doctors argue against these laws and say, you can refuse all treatment and you can stop eating or drinking, we'll take great care of you. And of course, they will take great care. But there's all these testimonies from families saying, it was a terrible thing. The person I love to go through, it was terrible to watch. I watched my father diminish to a skeleton. It took weeks. And I think in any other service or industry, if you had these kind of complaints, you would be going, are you sure this is the best service we can be offering? And that doesn't happen in the medical profession a great deal as far as I can see. And I think it needs to happen. And I think that's partly because it's been difficult, because politically on this issue, I've been forced into a position of largely being adversarial with palliative care because they have been fierce opponents. They've shifted a lot. And I think that's because, frankly, they've been dominated by Catholic palliative care, and they obviously have a deep moral objection. And I don't want to be adversarial with palliative care because these two things are so interlinked. But I think because palliative care is a relatively new branch of medicine compared to, say, oncology, and there are turf wars in medicine as there are in everything, I think palliative care feels threatened by this. And they needn't, because what assisted dying is trying to address is what palliative care is trying to address. And those of us that advocate for assisted dying freely and happily acknowledge not just the value of palliative care, but the value of palliative care to the majority of people who will die, even the majority of people who choose VAD.
Yes, and one aspect I'm particularly interested in is the grief reaction of the family and families who watch their family members suffer, and how that influences. And you still hear that as a reason people won't have chemotherapy because 40 years ago my neighbour or my uncle had chemo and it was terrible. So that's a valid reason not to have treatment. So there's a lot of unknowns in this field, Andrew, and we need to think of dying as an a physiological act that we need to investigate, but it's so emotional.
Oh, look, I agree. It's a physiological act, it's a spiritual act, it's a social act, it's a medical act. It's all these things combined. As the legislative battle hopefully starts to draw to a close, what I want Go Gentle to become, I want us to work across and far more closely with the medical community, not in an advocacy or adversarial way. But I think what you just talked about, there are so many complex and difficult questions. Why is there such a high incidence of futile care at the end of life, for example? There are all these complex family dynamics, which are very difficult. I don't think this is just on the medical profession. It's also about our death literacy generally. I was contacted by a family the mother is a doctor and the father used VAD, and the family supported the choice, and the mother still assesses people for VAD, but the family were very distressed by the death. Not that it was painful, but that they somehow felt complicit in ending the father's life. And I've since spoken with the daughter, and she said there needs to be more support for families that go through this. And I think that's right for VAD. I think there's so much more we can do in this space at the end of life. As a doctor in the Netherlands put it to me, she used a great word about death. She said, she was talking about euthanasia. She said, I feel like I'm doing something grand. It is a grand thing. Death is a grand thing. It's big. It's bigger than us. And that's why, although politically I've found myself adversarial to palliative care, I have incredible respect for what they do and what they're trying to do. And I'd say for oncologists too, because, I spoke to Philip Parente and Cam McLaren and Dr. Ross Jennings, Dr. Mitchell Chipman, others in your profession. And to me, it's one of the first questions I asked Cam and Phil when I interviewed them was, from where I sit, it seems like a very grim profession. What am I missing? And they were very quick to say, no. There is so much life in what we do, and there is so much honor in helping people through this passage of their lives, and sometimes to live a lot longer. So I have a great respect for those of you who work at this end of the spectrum. It's both rich and grand and challenging and sometimes very hard.
Look, for me, it's meaningful. You do something every day that's meaningful, not trivial, not no one cares in the end, but it certainly means a lot. And that then gives you some some cause to make sure you keep doing as best as you can. If something's not meaningful, it doesn't really matter if you do a good job or not. Andrew, I know we have to finish shortly, but I want to take you to the situation where no one would argue that life is meaningful. Someone, say, with significant dementia or in a vegetative state. I'm not trying to diminish that at all. And having said it's not meaningful, it may be very meaningful to the family, but not to that individual. You would think that would be maybe a more easy sell for euthanasia or not voluntary assisted dying and the patient giving it themselves, but that's actually a harder sell.
I think so. And I'm not on the same page as some of my fellow advocates on this. And I think it's a harder sell. I totally get it. It's by far the most common thing raised with me when I do any kind of public conversation, because we know dementia and Alzheimer's over 80, I think, is our second biggest killer. And I've certainly seen it in my family, my extended family. So many people listening will know this story and how harrowing it can be. I think the problem is, I would entirely support the idea of euthanasia for people with dementia because of their suffering. But I think it's a very difficult thing to ask a doctor to do, because the core of these laws is that person needs to be able to competently ask for a doctor to do that. And if that person can't do that, and look, it's been argued, and it is being argued, that, well, you could have advanced care directives, you could have video messages. And yes, I believe all that is true, but it's still a big thing. If you can't look that person in the eye and they can't look back at you and say, yes, this is what I want, I'm quite sure this is what I want, I think that's a hard thing to ask of a medical professional. And that's why I balk at it, even though I acknowledge it as the most, in some ways, the most pressing and the most commonly asked about part of this debate. And it's a difficult question. In the Netherlands, I followed a dementia case and spoke to the people at their life-ending clinic that deals with those special cases. First of all, I saw there was this particular woman, she had to go through so many hoops to prove that she knew what she wanted. But the person that ran the clinic put it beautifully. He said, she has to decide to leave the ball before midnight. In other words, she has to decide to end her life earlier than would have happened naturally, while she can still competently request this. If she can't competently request it, then she will drift off into the grey.
Mm. Yes. Do you think in 50 years' time it will be different? Do you think it's harder at the beginning and then objections will slip away? Because in the end, it's actually really only a very small number of people. I'm always constantly surprised at how many people cling to life for any reason and will accept suffering. They would not want this. And that's such a strong human emotion. So it's a particular, maybe not one type of person, but certainly it's not the commonest thing to want this. So it's a very individual and a very stable number if you look in the Scandinavian or the North European countries.
Yes, and stable in America as well. Look, what's become really clear to me, and particularly spending much of the last year doing a deep dive into Victoria, it takes incredible determination and courage to do this. And not everybody is built like that, which doesn't, I'm not suggesting someone who doesn't is in any way weak. Dying is not easy. What was it Bette Davis said? Dying is not for sissies. But it takes amazing courage to do this. And I remember I interviewed a man called Peter Jones 6 weeks before the date when he was due to end his life using VAD. And it was one of the most heartbreaking moments I've had in a lot of deep conversations over the last 6 years. When he was completely reconciled with his choice. He had no lungs left. His future was awful if he didn't choose this. But he had one daughter, not married, one daughter, the love of his life. And he's in the middle of our conversation, he stopped and asked me, how am I going to say goodbye to my daughter? And it always, every time I think about it, I think, imagine you put yourself in that position to knowingly say goodbye to everything you know and love. That is a mighty, mighty thing to do. It's mighty hard. And that's why the numbers are small. It's, whatever all the other safeguards, and there are so many, that's the invisible one. It takes great courage and great determination.
Yes, I think that's the fundamental part, isn't it? And we should, above all, respect people's wishes, not deny the fact that there is suffering, there can be suffering, And most people actually are okay with that. It's not to say that we should let it happen or, we shouldn't try and alleviate it. But, that's part of the cycle of life. But for those who don't want that.
Well, look, most people that choose VAD, they have suffered mightily. It's not that they don't want suffering. It's that they can't take any more. And they don't want to be so degraded to themselves and to their families. As a palliative care physician in New Zealand said to me, the person watches the family's suffering as much as the family watches theirs. So it's not a golden ticket. It's not like you have this great life and then, I've just found this really easy way out. It's not an easy way out. You only do it because things got really, really bad. And as you said, people cling to life. And we started with the Hippocratic Oath. I'll go back to another medical philosopher who's, I think the pharmacists use him. They quote his oath, a man called Maimonides. And he put it beautifully. He said, may I never see in a patient anything other than another person in pain. And I think that's a pretty good instruction for medical professionals at the end of life. It's not about what you think. It's about exploring what that person is experiencing and seeing what is the best path for them and to help them with that path.
And I think that's on that note, we should really stop and reflect for our own practice, everyone listening, and talk about it amongst yourselves, because if you are not engaged in this, you may be harming your patient. And as you said, that's the essence of what we do, is facilitating care at every level. So, Andrew, it's been a real pleasure. In my own department, I have a very radical anti-VAD staff member and a staff member who I think has done more VAD than any other. So we have very interesting department meetings, always interested in many views. It's been an absolute pleasure. We'll put links to your website. And I believe actually you do a podcast. Have you got any hints for me?
Oh, you're doing just fine. Absolutely fine. But I always would encourage you to sing a song at the end of every episode, Eva.
Yes, somebody set you up for that. That is a setup.
No one did. But I can see Rachel is laughing her head off. So I'm sure she'll tell me why that was such a bullseye.
Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Bye-bye.
See you.
You've been listening to the Oncology Podcast. If you enjoyed today's edition and would like to subscribe, head over to our website, oncologynews.com.au, and sign up to our newsletter. Thanks for listening.